As Putin continues to demand that Ukraine cede the Donbass region to Russia, he's trying to hide a big problem. Donetsk, which is part of the Donbass, is home to a wall that is already stopping Russia cold in Ukraine. Putin needs to break that wall to take Donetsk. Russia's forces can't do it. They're smashing up against 30 miles of territory where they pay for every inch that they gain with blood. Now all Ukraine has to do is avoid the massive strategic mistake that one of its allies is pressuring it to make. Collectively, those 30 miles are known as the Donetsk Fortress Belt, and they amount to an enormous barrier that stands in the way of Putin's goal to take the Donbass. Located in the western Donetsk region, the belt is among the most fortified parts of Ukraine, as the country's forces have spent the better part of a decade transforming it into a wall designed to destroy Russian soldiers. Several cities and settlements combine to form this belt. 4 major Ukrainian urban centers, namely Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and Konstantinivka, have created a nearly impenetrable barrier that Russia hasn't been able to test properly yet. The embattled settlements of Pokrovsk and Chaziv Yar sit just outside the belt. Once the heart of Ukraine's industrial region, these cities now combine to form a series of fortifications that link with smaller settlements in the surrounding areas and the logistical artery that is the H20 highway to give Putin his toughest challenge in Ukraine yet. It's a challenge that Russia's president doesn't want to meet. And we'll be covering 4 reasons why it would be a strategic mistake for Ukraine not to force Putin to meet that challenge soon, so keep watching. Ukraine has placed a special focus on the cities that make up the fortress belt because Russia has occupied them once before. Back in 2014, the Wall Street Journal reports all 4 of the major cities that make up the fortress belt were seized by Russian paramilitary forces. Ukraine booted those forces out in relatively short order. However, the Russian warning shot had been fired and Ukraine took it very seriously. Ukraine knew, long before anybody else, that Putin and his forces would be back to steal what Putin believes to be his. So the country set about transforming the formerly occupied cities into the fortress belt. That belt is now stronger than ever and ready to defend Donetsk and potentially the rest of Ukraine from the Russian onslaught. The Wall Street Journal says that Ukraine has spent over $1 billion on fortifications in the Donetsk region alone. With much of the eastern part of the territory under Russian occupation, the obvious conclusion is that most of this money has been poured into the fortress belt. Over a decade of effort has turned the territory into a Ukrainian stronghold, made up of a network of trenches with anti-tank ditches, rows of concrete pyramids known as dragon's teeth, barbed wire, and minefields, the journal says. What this means, as The Economist noted in a January 7th article, is that Ukraine now has the 30-mile fortress belt that it wished it had back when Putin's forces invaded in 2022. Such complete defensive lines would have stopped Russia far deeper into Donetsk, according to the commander of the drone battalion that is part of Ukraine's 44th Mechanized Brigade, Vyacheslav Shutenko. The same outlet highlights how extensive these new defensive lines have become. Near Slovyansk and Kramatorsk, the defensive lines stretch for almost 200 meters, or about 656 feet. They are filled with belts of razor wire and anti-infantry wire laid to tear Russia's soldiers to shreds as they attempt to cross. Behind that wire are the anti-tank ditches, which are over 6 feet deep, 9.8 feet wide, and amount to open graves just waiting for Russian armor that will get trapped and then destroyed by artillery and drones. And so it continues. More wire, more ditches, mines and dragon's teeth make their appearances a little closer to the cities. These fortifications run across the entire 30 miles of the fortress belt, and they will be incredibly difficult to break down. After all, these are just the defenses. Ukraine's offensive weapons, especially its FPV drones, will be on constant patrols, aided by reconnaissance drones and ready to deliver their explosive payloads to the Russian soldiers and equipment that are unfortunate enough to be ordered to make the crossing. There are also similar scenes emerging in the cities that make up the belt, The Economist says. Konstantinivka, which is widely believed to be Putin's next target if Pokrovsk falls, already has streets that are laced with razor wire. Ukraine is signaling its intent to bleed Russia dry for every inch that it attempts to take in the belt. And even the fall of Konstantinivka would just mean that there are 3 cities left, including the much larger Slovyansk and Kramatorsk. Ukraine's fortress belt gets even cleverer than that. According to the Atlantic Council, concealed within the fortress belt are non-traditional barriers that complement all of the static ones we've just discussed. Ukraine is building concealed and flexible defensive networks that amount to small-scale defensive positions that are embedded in tree lines or situated underground. Decoys and remote fires support this network of nodes, which are in place to both ambush invading Russian soldiers and to corral them into pre-prepared kill zones where drones and artillery will rain down upon them. The Ukraine war has often been called a meat grinder for Russia's soldiers. These nodes combine to form the funnel that moves that meat into the defenses that will tear that meat to shreds. In short, the fortress belt is hell made real on earth for Russia's soldiers. But if Putin wants Donetsk, the belt has to fall. And Putin really wants Donetsk. As the Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, points out, the regions of Donetsk that are behind the fortress belt are considerably less defensible than the belt itself. Flat ground comes after the favorable terrain seen in the belt, the ISW says, and Ukraine would have to rush to build more fortifications across the Kharkiv and Dnipropetrovsk sectors to defend against a Russian advance that would naturally accelerate once the hilly terrain of the fortress belt is conquered. The Wall Street Journal agrees with this assessment, adding that Putin likely sees the price that he would have to pay in soldiers' blood to capture the fortress belt as one that is worth paying. It's just one that he wants to avoid paying, as you'll discover when we get to the strategic mistake that Ukraine has to avoid. The fall of the fortress belt would almost inevitably lead to the loss of Donetsk. Putin would have everything that he wants for now. And that brings us to the strategic mistake that Ukraine has to avoid making. Right now, the fortress belt is making headlines not because it's a brilliant example of the defenses that Ukraine has set up, but because it's part of the territory that Putin is demanding that Ukraine cede to Russia. The reason for those headlines is simple. The US has allegedly renewed its pressure on Ukraine to give up Donetsk and the Donbas region. On January 26, the United 24 media reported that the Kremlin had reaffirmed that the ceding of the Donbas region would be key to any peace negotiations with Ukraine. That affirmation came in the wake of talks between representatives of Ukraine and Russia in Abu Dhabi. Putin's favorite mouthpiece, Dmitry Peskov, made clear what Russia wants in a statement where he said, "The territorial issue is of fundamental importance to the Russian side." Ukraine continues to reject this request, though a second round of talks is scheduled to begin during the weekend starting on January 31st. Just a day later, the US reportedly came wading in with a new round of pressure intended to force Ukraine's hand in giving Putin exactly what he wants. According to Reuters, the US has told Ukraine that it will provide security guarantees if a peace agreement is reached. However, it will likely only provide those guarantees if Ukraine hands over the Donbas. This is a massive twist in the proceedings, as it would essentially make Ukraine subservient to the US and more vulnerable to Russia. After all, losing the Donbas means losing Donetsk, and with Donetsk gone, Russia would control the fortress belt. Making things worse for Ukraine is that there is a cloud of uncertainty over what guarantees the US would actually provide. It was only on January 25th that Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky was claiming that a document on the security guarantees to be provided by the US was 100% ready and just waiting to be signed. Presumably, that document didn't contain any conditions about Ukraine ceding the Donbas, otherwise Zelensky wouldn't be saying that it's ready. Just 2 days later, the US is telling Ukraine to make the single biggest strategic mistake it could make against Russia, allegedly. The reason that we say allegedly is that January 27th also brought with it a report in the Kyiv Independent in which the US denied attempting to use security guarantees as the carrot on the end of a stick that would see Ukraine lose the Donbas. However, the outlet could only quote an unnamed US source who is reportedly close to the matter. That source said that the US is not trying to force any territorial concessions upon Ukraine, before adding, "Both sides must agree to a peace deal, but the contents of the peace deal are up to Russia and Ukraine." That quote doesn't specifically say that the US is using promises of security guarantees to get its way, but the denial of pressure for concessions is hope enough for Ukraine. It has to be. Losing the fortress belt that Ukraine has spent so long building would be an enormous mistake, and there are 4 key reasons why. The first of the reasons is also the most obvious. Losing the fortress belt leaves Ukraine low on defenses. That's obviously the case while the Ukraine war is ongoing, which is why Ukraine must use this 30-mile barrier to wreak as much havoc on Russia as possible. However, it would also be true if Ukraine ceded the fortress belt as part of a peace deal with Russia. As the Wall Street Journal notes, taking the fortress belt would put Russia in a prime position to seize Donetsk and to further fight into Ukraine whenever it's ready. The belt will become both a launching point and a barrier to any future Ukrainian effort to retake its territory. Why would that matter if the ceding of the belt is a part of a peace deal? Zelensky said it himself back in April 2025 when he pointed out that Putin has broken a staggering 25 peace agreements over the previous decade. Ukraine knows that Russia's president is a sort of man who will say one thing and do another, and it believes that any peace agreement formed that doesn't involve Russia leaving Ukraine entirely isn't really a deal at all. It's a piece of paper that Putin will tear up the moment he feels Russia is ready to take the rest of Ukraine. This is an assessment that Nick Reynolds, who is a research fellow for land warfare at the Royal United Services Institute, broadly agrees with. Reynolds tells the BBC, "Even if the Trump administration tries to use ongoing US support or security guarantees as leverage based on previous Russian behavior, Based on the explicitly transactional approach that the US administration has taken, it's hard to see how the Ukrainian government would want to give up that territory. Very hard indeed, especially when you take the second reason why ceding the fortress belt would be such a massive mistake. Russia is destroying itself in its attempt to take the Donbass, and attacking the fortress belt would only lead to more losses. Ukraine today says that Russia is unlikely to be able to capture the Donetsk region by August 2027, which is an assessment it appears to have drawn from an interview published by the ISW in December 2025. That interview noted that Russia has managed to conduct small infiltration operations into Konstantinivka, which is one of the fortress belt cities, but those infiltration attempts haven't amounted to much, and it's going to take so many resources to tackle the entire belt that 2027 is the best that Putin can hope for. 2028 appears to be just as likely, assuming that Ukraine continues to receive support from its international partners. Assuming an end of 2028 deadline, that would mean almost another 3 years of fighting for the belt to fall. And Russia knows that it can't sustain the kinds of losses required to finish that fight. Pokrovsk has shown Putin that much. We mentioned Pokrovsk earlier as one of the cities that lies just outside the fortress belt. The city, which had a pre-war population of around 60,000 people, has been under siege for well over a year, with the Wall Street Journal claiming that Russia has amassed over 150,000 troops in the Pokrovsk sector for a final assault on the city that was meant to have ended last year but is still ongoing. Russia has already lost enormous numbers of soldiers in the battle for Pokrovsk. In October, David Axe claimed in his Trench Arc column that Russia has sustained 100,000 casualties between the start of 2025 and the beginning of October, all while trying to claim Pokrovsk. About a month later, Zelensky said that Ukraine's drones had eliminated 25,000 Russian soldiers, most of whom were operating in the Pokrovsk sector. There have been many more deaths since, but you get the picture. Pokrovsk has been far from an easy city for Russia to take. That city has been characterized as the gateway to Donetsk in Russian media, but nothing could be further from the truth now that the fortress belt has been built up. Some of the cities that Russia still has to topple, and it hasn't even taken Pokrovsk yet, are even bigger. Sloviansk, for instance, had a pre-war population of 111,000 people. Kramatorsk is even bigger with a pre-war population of 200,000 people, according to Le Monde. Much larger cities than Pokrovsk have more territory to capture, which means an even slower Russian advance. Ukraine will also take the lessons that it has learned from the defense of Pokrovsk into these cities. So the question has to be asked, if Russia has taken so long and lost so many soldiers in its siege of Pokrovsk, just how much longer will it take, and how many more losses will it have to absorb to topple the fortress belt? Making sure that Russia gets an answer to that question is a huge reason for Ukraine to force Russia into the fight for the fortress belt that Putin is trying to avoid. Who knows, Ukraine might even be able to achieve the casualty ratio of 15 Russian soldiers to every 1 Ukrainian that it's seeing in Pokrovsk. You can find out more about that ratio and what it means for Russia's attempts to take Pokrovsk in our video. The point in all of this is that Russia has been trying to frame Donetsk as a free game, as United 24 media puts it. Putin wants the West, and especially the US, to think that Russia will easily take the rest of Donetsk once Pokrovsk falls, precisely because he knows that nothing is further from the truth. As long as Ukraine has the fortress belt, it has what amounts to a weapon that will cost Russia years of extra warfare, along with hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions more casualties. The craziest thing about all of this is that the 2027 and 28 estimates may even be a little bit too kind to Russia and its bumbling war effort, and that's because of the third reason why Ukraine ceding the fortress belt will be a massive mistake. Russia's rate of advance is slowing dramatically. That's according to the New Voice of Ukraine, which highlights statements made by ISW analysts that the 2027 deadline has conditions that Russia isn't coming close to meeting. For Russia to seize Donetsk by the end of August 2027, it would have to maintain the pace of advances it saw in November 2025. And even then, taking the region would be a big ask. But Russia hasn't been maintaining the pace of its monthly advances. December 2025 and early January 26 saw that pace slow to a crawl, which, if Russia isn't able to speed up, could add months or even years for the time it would take for Donetsk to fall. We don't need to go much deeper into this reason beyond noting the obvious. The longer that Russia has to fight for Donetsk, the more of its soldiers, tanks, artillery, and other equipment it will lose. We said earlier that Ukraine will bleed Russia dry for every inch that it takes in the fortress belt, and we meant that in terms of time, equipment, and monetary cost, as much as we did for the price that Russia is paying in manpower. And finally, that brings us to the fourth reason why Ukraine ceding the fortress belt would be a huge strategic mistake. Ukraine likely still has no idea what a security guarantee in return for making this decision would look like. After all, Russia has made it clear that there are certain people whom it won't allow to take part in the ongoing protection of Ukraine. January 26 saw Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service head Sergei Naryshkin claim that terms being put forth by the Coalition of the Willing, which has also promised security guarantees to Ukraine, were absolutely unacceptable. That likely amounts to Naryshkin saying that coalition members won't be allowed into Ukraine under a peace deal. A day later, the Russian State Duma Defense Committee Deputy Chairman, Alexei Zhuravlyov, seemed to confirm this by openly rejecting the prospect of any NATO troops deploying into Ukraine after the war. That means the Coalition of the Willing is out. And it also leads to a lot of questions being asked about the US promises, given that it's a NATO member. Ultimately, Putin won't stop at Donetsk or the Donbass if he gets his hands on them. Russia's president has very openly said that he doesn't consider Ukraine to be a real country, to the point where he believes that Ukrainians are actually Russians. Ceding the fortress belt today means that Ukraine sets itself up for a fall tomorrow. And with Russia struggling to maintain the strength of its assaults, that is a blunder from which Ukraine would never recover. So it won't make that mistake. It will keep its 30 miles of fortifications and Russia will bleed trying to take them. Russia is doing that right now, and it's because Ukraine has an unexpected ally on its side. For centuries, this ally has so often worked in Russia's favor, but now it's fighting for Ukraine, and Russia has no answers. If you want to find out who that ally is, check out our video. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to The Military Show for more in-depth explorations into the reality that Putin is trying to hide from. And thank you, as always, for watching.